behalf of the Bear Education Foundation, Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources, and DePaul University and Citizen U, welcome to Educators Rise for Equity. And I want to start with mentioning to you, if you can grab a notebook or a piece of paper, we'd like to start with this question of what moment with your students or when in education in general has brought you the greatest joy and feelings of connection with your purpose in education. So that can be either in your role as an educator or as someone who supports education, but there's been some moment in that experience that has definitely brought you connection and joy. If you could just take a moment and kind of remember what that was, and if it involved a student or a situation, just jot down the name of that situation or that student, because we'd like you to keep that feeling of deep connection, that feeling of meaning and purpose, and that your life was having impact as the focus as we go through today. And I want to start today with deep gratitude. As I mentioned as we started, this program is brought to you today in large part because of the vision and the support of the CEO of the Bear Education Foundation, Sheila Smith. So as I start, I want to personally thank Sheila for supporting webinars like this one that really look to serve teachers and students through our advancing of racial equity and civic education. And in particular, we want to also thank the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program for always having at the forefront how we can use Library of Congress to deepen the inquiry-based teaching that we do in our classrooms. So I thank both of them immensely, and I also thank DePaul University, who allows me to do these kinds of work and is supporting a couple of our adjuncts who are here today. With that, I'd like to introduce you to who's going to bring you this incredible webinar today, and with our intention today to inspire you, to get you curious, and to leave you with some practical strategies. So the way that I'm going to introduce my colleagues is to ask them a question about what brought them here today and to give you a little bit of their background. I have to say first, I am so honored to be with these three women who bring a vast depth of expertise and knowledge, but also who I just cherish, each one of them very deeply. So first, let me start by introducing you to Dr. Tina Curry. Dr. Curry is an incredibly experienced educator. She is an equity coach and she is an instructional coach. She's a CPS educator for over 20 years. She is a published author and an adjunct professor at National Louis University as well as DePaul University. She is a woman who has taught me more about racial equity and compassion than anyone I know. And I am always inspired when I am in her space. And so I'm going to ask you first, Tina, what brings you to this work?
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to spend this next hour with you in this capacity. So what brings me to this work is my pursuit for justice and equity are central to my life. And creating equity in my own classroom and helping others to do the same is really a moral mandate for me. Like, this work is truly my ministry, and that's what draws me to such platforms.
Thank you. And I have to say, I've had the honor of seeing Felicia teach and seeing Felicia coach other teachers, and there is no one better at instilling equity in all that she does. And she's going to share kind of those perspectives as we go around. Next, I'd like to introduce you to a woman who has consistently inspired me, Felicia Shaviri. Felicia grew up in Englewood and spent 2 decades as a corrections officer in the Cook County prison. She left that work, thank goodness, and became an equity and a life coach and a wellness coach. Felicia also works with young people around challenges of recidivism in criminal justice system. And she is one of the most compassionate, kind people I know, and my go-to person when I need perspective. So Felicia, what brings you to this work? Unmute.
You know, it's remembering to take it off mute. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited to be here with you. And I am here today because I believe tremendously in the power of love and the power of connection. And having worked in the criminal justice system, I saw so often individuals that were coming in and really all they needed was a wise word from someone, whether it was a teacher, or a grandmother, or a neighbor. And I come here to share with you my personal and professional experiences. And I really do believe through the power of connection and love, we can change the entire planet.
Thanks so much, Felicia. And then finally, I want to share with you an educator who I deeply respect and admire and who truly always transforms me, and that's Susie Evans. Susie Evans is a former classroom teacher. She is the go-to professional development provider for Alexia. She has also been one of the founding deliverers of the Our American Voice curriculum, and truly a change maker in this planet. So Susie, what brings you to this work?
Well, hi everyone. So glad to be here. And you know, as an educator, I've made an individual commitment to anti-racism, equity my whole life. But right now I can just feel this movement and I know I can't do it alone. And I look around and I am going to get together with colleagues that can make a bigger difference than I can as an individual. And that's it.
That's beautiful, Susie. And just to give you a little bit of who I am, I'm Dr. Donna Keel from DePaul University. I'm a professor in our Ed Leadership program and pre-service teaching program. But before that, for the majority of my career, I spent 30 years as a teacher, a school counselor, and as a principal. And for me, this work is what I'm called to do, in that everything that I've done for the past 30 and 40 years has been to touch the hearts of the children entrusted to my care and the teachers entrusted to my care. The work of civic education and of using whatever resources we can historically as well as psychologically and emotionally to inspire our students and teachers has always been my passion. And so I'm honored to be here with you today. And so we bring with you this really great diverse perspective. This is going to be a webinar unlike most webinars you've ever had around equity. And I apologize for the dogs. Of course that the doorbell rings. So our intention today with this webinar is to support you during a very difficult time. We know more than anything else, our educators in this time have been called to do things that we never ever anticipated. So we want to support you during this time. We want to give you some really practical tools. So here's what I know. When I would go to workshops, remember they used to have workshops face-to-face back in the day? It's like a historic event. We used to actually gather in rooms. When I would go to workshops, I would roll my eyes when they would give me all kinds of information that I could never use in my classroom. So what we want to give you today is things that you can use right away. So we want to give you some strategies for using the Library of Congress primary sources, but we also want to give you strategies on a practical level that will support the use of primary sources and help you to navigate what seems to be changing minute by minute, which is the uncertain world of teaching coming this fall. And more importantly, we want to take care of each of you from the lens of what's been happening to us and inspire you with meaning and purpose and hopefully reignite in you that which brought you to become an educator, to be associated with education in the first place. So let's talk about the truth. So here's the thing, we're gonna talk about racial equity and we're real conscious that we're gonna make a whole lot of mistakes when talking about racism and as we attempt to live in equity, but we want to, our goal in doing this as we come together is to have open minds and hearts as we move forward. The preparation for this webinar to meet with Susie and Felicia and Tina has been life-changing for me, to be able to be in space where we can respect each other and regard for each other, but also say the things that maybe have been deeply rooted in our culture, but we need to work through, knowing that that's okay, that we're on a path to work through it, to face it, and to move on. So what we want to create today for all of you is a safe space to explore, to grow, and to learn together and to ask questions. So as we go through today, if you do have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. And we do have a couple of folks who are going to monitor the chat for us. Brennan Palmer and Amanda Wang from DePaul will monitor that chat for us and let us know if there is some important, compelling questions. The other thing I want to let you know is that in the chat, Brennan will put a Google document that will have the process that you need for CPDUs if you are a teacher, as well as the process to follow up if you would like to earn a micro-credential from DePaul University for attending all 3 webinars. In order to earn that micro-credential, there's a bit of a reflection piece that you would do that's really job embedded so that it makes sense in your teaching and not very time consuming, but will also help you to deeply understand the content that we're going to share with you today. So let's look at what really happened. It's been a rough 5 months for everyone in the world. And if we look at us as teachers and educators in the United States, in March, we were forced to leave our students and in many cases not take things with us, get out of our schools and go home. That happened in March. And I think when we all had that happen, I know when I did, I thought, oh, this is going to be for a couple weeks. And then weeks turned into a month. And then in April, there was this daily ticking of death and of uncertainty and of a virus that no one seemed to be able to control. And this constant debate about masks or no masks and about what was going on. And so our daily lives were consumed with attempting to remotely teach, attempting to deal with the uncertainty and building stress upon stress. Then in May, we all witnessed heinous acts of racism, murder, and then protest. And May, I believe, broke us open in a way that is transformative. And it continued in June with the uncertainty and divisiveness that grew in our country. And then in July, we added this ongoing debate about what school would look like, what teaching should be like, what's the fear, who's caring for whom, all kinds of protocols and forms. And I don't know about many of you, but I've never even imagined attending as many webinars as I have. We've had 5 significant months of life-changing trauma. And to give us perspective in that, let's look at it from another lens.
So what I'm going to ask you to do, just for a moment, I'm going to ask you to shift your thinking and your emotions a little bit here. Because what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to ask you to imagine what it's like to be Black. And then imagine what it's like to be Black and be in your classroom. And the reason why we are acknowledging the history is so that we can come to a place of understanding and empathy for our peers, for our students, and for their families in this critical moment. So it's 1619. Imagine being stripped away, forced out of your homeland, forced away from your family, and brought into slavery. And then imagine being a Black woman and having your body used to reproduce non-citizens for cheap labor. And then imagine decades and decades and decades later, even if you were a slave living in a free state, you could still be sent back to your owner. So there was no hope for freedom. And then decades and decades later, imagine as a Black person making some advancements, starting to make something happen for yourselves. And then having white people to create a white protective society to disenfranchise you. And then decades and decades and decades later, you have a national leader who rises among you, demanding civil rights legislation to advance the lives of people of color. And then to have him assassinated because he had the audacity to try to change the world. And then fast forward to current day. George Floyd could have been your father, your brother, your nephew, your uncle. Having him killed by a white police officer while other police officers just stood by and watched. I want you to imagine that, because this is the historical racism, and trauma that your students carry with them. And if you are going to do this work with us, that means you can never forget that.
Thank you so much, Tina. It's compelling to look at the parallel of what we've been through in the past 5 months and what African Americans have also been through historically. We begin today with that pause to reflect. So this webinar is the first in a series of 3. We'll begin with reflection. We'll begin by looking at healing what's happening so that we can move forward. To look at webinar 2, we'll use inquiry and self-awareness to question and to grow in our open-mindedness and open-heartedness and in our civic awareness. And we'll then conclude with webinar 3, where we'll focus on empathy.
So Donna, let me ask you this question. Why now? Why is this happening now when systemic racism has been happening for 400 years? Why now? This is not new.
It's not new. And here's a reality. If we look at what's been happening to us, and it's something for us to reflect on and consider, our lives for a long time have had a sense of urgency. The one thing that I hear in my own personal life all the time is, I know you're busy, but. That's always the preface to anything that somebody says to me. Still today, it's, I know you're busy, but. The reality is we have this urgency about everything we do. The pandemic caused us to stop. We had to pause. And so when we look at the research and some of the insights that have come from places like Showing Up for Racial Justice, what we realize is that the stopping of our urgency by the pandemic allowed us to open our hearts in a new way as allies and to see racism right in front of us and to pause long enough that it got under our skin and into our hearts. So why now? It's because now is the right time, and now is the time that we have to seize that opportunity. We must make this a time of transformation in our country because we've tried this before. As Susie and I were reflecting on this webinar, we both have been knocking around education for a couple decades or so. Probably me longer than her, but we realized that nothing we'd done before has really made a substantial impact. None of the marches, none of the riots, none of the protests. We need to do something now. And so, Susie, why do you think reflection is so important right now?
You know, it's one of those things I cherish. Right now in my own life, I've had a lot of recent challenges with long-term illness and death and a lot of change in my life. And boy, that can be a distraction. And it's always like, I'll have time for myself. I'll have time to grow later. And honestly, it's the most important time to stop and reflect and get that sense of who we are. It's only then when we can reflect and know who we are that we can move forward and make that difference.
So true. So let's talk about where we start. So here, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, where do we start? What does that research tell us?
Yeah, so thank you so much for asking. We kind of have this, if you can see, we're doing an interview back and forth of each other to make this interesting. At DePaul, we've been delving into the research around trauma and stress because we've noticed some things in students and in teachers, and especially as we've tried to support teachers. So here's what we know. Here's what the research says. Unlike anything acute that's traumatic in a stress, like 9/11 or like a fire or any of those, this stress, this COVID-19 stress, has been chronic stress. It continues and it never eases up. What we've seen then is this incredible impact on those of us in education, different than some other fields, similar to frontline workers and healthcare workers, but a bit different. Because we can't access our students. We can't go in and help them and heal them. We're at a distance. So we know that we've lost a heck of a lot from this pandemic. So Tina, from your experience as a classroom teacher, what do you think we've lost in these past few months?
A great deal. We've essentially lost just the way we carry out our daily lives. That even includes the way that we teach. We've lost our sense of safety and security. You can only imagine what that's like for a person to not feel safe and not feel secure, not have stability in our lives. We've lost our sense of trust in our system. And then here's the one that a lot of us are holding on to even right now, as some of you are listening to our voices, that anticipatory grief, because we have no idea what is going to happen as we're trying to prepare to receive our students and show up for them. We don't even know what the platform will be, if we'll be in classrooms, we'll be virtual. We are experiencing just a lot of grief around, like how we're going to be safe. It's a terrible fate for us as educators. Felicia, as a life coach and an equity coach, what can we do now?
Well, I think from all of our personal experiences and from listening to the research and what we know about the research, we could take 3 steps. And I think these are probably the most important steps. One is to pay attention to our hearts and what is happening in our minds. I think it's important that we have a heart that's open enough to be willing to help one another heal what it is that we are experiencing. And I think when it comes to teaching, I think it's so important that when I think about the educators, it's so important that you come from a place of having done some work on yourself, where with your heart, you're aware of how you feel and how you're showing up on a continuous basis with your students, or when we do go back to school for the students. And, I think oftentimes, we just get caught up in, there's a lot of things, there's so many emotions that are happening with all of us, right? And I just have to, if I could just share a quick story about what I was feeling, even as a life coach. I think it was around the 27th of May, I was out for a run. And actually just thinking about this story gets me a little choked up, because usually I'm in a happy place. Most times, I try to keep my spirits pretty high, but the world was very heavy. Anytime I got on social media, there was just all of this chaos that was happening. And I got choked up while I was out running. I could feel the lump in my throat. I felt like I couldn't breathe. And then, it just adds on from there. It's like, what's happening to me? And so I paused for a moment, and I actually sent Dr. Keel a text, because I needed to talk. I didn't want to talk to anyone, but I just had to write it, and I had to send it out. And I sent it to her, and I just talked about how heavy the world was, what I was feeling. And there was a struggle internally, I think, for me, wanting to be angry with about all that was happening. And I couldn't feel hate for anyone else. And so I got to a point where I could hear this voice that said, no, you're not going to hate. You're not going to hate. You're not going to be angry. You're going to relax, and you're going to focus on your breathing, and everything is gonna be just fine, but it was one of those things where, even for me being a coach and doing this kind of work, it was even challenging. So I send out to everyone, when you find yourself getting wrapped up in that tornado, it's so important that we stand on the perimeters if we can, by focusing on our breath. So.
And I have to say, that text that came, it brought me to a place of tears of gratitude for Felicia as a person, but also then wondering. I wondered, okay, what am I going to do? And Felicia said to me, there's not something you can do, but it's something you can be. And that is to be that ally. And so, Susie, as white educators, what's going to help us on this journey?
A good segue too. As a white educator, I feel knowledgeable about the journey, but I realized lately how much I still don't understand. So if you're going to seek to understand, the bottom line is I've got to be a good ally for my friends of color that understand deeper so that I can listen. So right now we've got a short video to show you that'll offer a way for you to think about our role as white allies.
Something different with my setup, and I don't know if it's working, but you will deal. Imagine your friend is building a house and they ask you to help, but you've never built a house before. So it'd probably be a good idea for you to put on some protective gear and listen to the person in charge. Otherwise, someone's gonna get seriously hurt. Look, I'm helping! It's the exact same idea when it comes to being an ally. An ally is a person that wants to fight for the equality of a marginalized group that they're not a part of. We need your help building this house, but you probably should listen so you know what to do first. Let's do this. So here are my 5 tips for being a good ally. Understand your privilege. Now, a lot of people get hung up on the word privilege, so let me break it down for you nice and easy. Privilege does not mean that you are rich, that you've had an easy life, that everything's been handed to you and you've never had to struggle or work hard. All it means is that there are some things in life that you will not experience or ever have to think about just because of who you are. It's kind of like those horses that have those blinders on. They can see just fine. There's just a whole bunch of stuff on the side that they don't even know exists. So for example, there are currently 29 states where you can legally be fired for being gay, and there are 34 states where you can legally be fired for being trans. Now, as a straight cis woman, those are things that I don't have to ever think about if I don't want to. I'm not going to be fired because I'm straight, and I'm not going to be fired because I'm cis. So it makes sense that before I can fight for the rights of others, I have to understand what rights I have and others don't. That's privilege. Listen and do your homework. It sounds like a no-brainer, but it's not possible for you to learn if you aren't willing to listen. So you gotta know when to zippa the lippa. I don't know. You get what I mean. But that's the thing that's so cool about social media. There are so many people sharing their stories all around the world and connecting with people that they normally would never get a chance to without the power of the internet. So do your homework. Start reading blogs, tweets, news articles, and stories so that you can get caught up on the issues that are important to the communities that you want to support. Speak up, but not over. If the Fight for Equality was a girl group, the ally wouldn't be the lead singer or the second lead singer. They'd be Michelle. An ally's job is to support. You want to make sure that you use your privilege and your voice to educate others, but make sure to do it in such a way that does not speak over the community members that you're trying to support or take credit for things that they are already saying. This isn't Mario Kart. Stay in your lane. Realize that you're going to make mistakes and apologize when you do. Nobody's perfect. Unlearning problematic things takes time and work, so you are bound to mess up and trip and fall. But don't worry, you can brush yourself off and get right back up. I'm back up! Just remember that it's not about your intent, it's about your impact. So when you get called out, make sure to listen, apologize, commit to changing your behavior, and move forward. Last but certainly not least, actually the most important thing on this list, is remember that ally is a verb. Saying you're an ally is not enough. You gotta do the work. 1 through 4. 1 through 4. As always, there are links in the video description box to some of the things I mentioned.
Okay, pop quiz there. What are those 5 tips? Just kidding. You do not have to put that in the chat. Donna, I've got a question for you as we begin to reflect. How can teachers help to heal on a regular basis? I'll let you get going there.
That was good, Susie. Thanks for giving me a little pause time, technology. So here's the thing, and this I got from Felicia. You know, it's that you have to take care of you first. You have to know that you're okay. You've got to get in touch with you. You've got to heal that part of you before you can start extending yourself to your students or to those around you. And that starts with reflection. So if you were ever part of any of our other webinars sponsored by BERA and the Library of Congress, we talked about teacher self-care. And at the time we did that, we talked about, you know, the little stress we were feeling as we were starting remote teaching. Well, it's far worse now. And what we really need to do to be allies so that we can show up, those of us who are white and those of us who are people of color, is we have to practice self-care first. And the way that we do that is to really reflect on how we are. We don't pause long enough amid all of the stressors and the articles and the webinars and the new research to see how we're doing. Ironically, but not surprisingly, Felicia's insight to we need to take care of ourselves is what's supported in the research around neuroscience and our effective ability to move forward in any initiative. What we have for you on the screen and what you have in the Google Drive that is in the chat is a really simple check-in. I actually do this check-in myself once a week so that I know exactly how I am, and it forces me to pause and to look internally about how's my life going and what do I need to work on, or what accomplishments have I made. What we really need to do is see how we are doing in areas of our mind, our spirit, our body. And the way we do that on this checklist is to rate your agreement with the statement on a 1 for strongly disagree to 5 to strongly agree. So for example, if you're able to always focus on the task in front of you and don't get distracted, you strongly agree. So what I find during COVID and what the research kind of predicts is I have no ability to focus for more than 30 seconds. It's like there's bright, shiny things all around me, especially in my inbox. If those of you who are teachers, I used to get a whole lot of email, like maybe 40 or 50 a day. Now I think I get 200 to 300 a day. And they're all really compelling and interesting and easily take me down rabbit holes. We need to really look at how is our mind doing? How is our spirit doing? Do we enjoy what we're doing? Then we need to look at our bodies. I can't stress important enough that you need to take care of that body to make sure that you can show up as an ally for your students, especially now when we're making that decision of, is school going to be in person? Is it going to be remote again? You got to take care of your body so that you're ready, whatever the context. And then look at your emotions. Emotions are very important. And if you remember the CALM technique we learned in other webinars, if not, we can also share that. But it's important to look at our emotions. And that's the area for me that often goes up and down. And here's the thing, if you use that tool that we gave you, it scores. There's an easy scoring set. So you take those numbers, you add them up, and here's a guide to your scores to tell you when you're on track and when you're not. And here's the other thing, give yourself a break. What I find when I do this is some weeks I'm at 0 to 30, and then some weeks I'm at 68 to 80. It really depends. It's gonna go up and down. The way to make sure that you stay on track so you can show up for this work and the important work for your students is to journal about it. Check in with yourself and say, how did this go? What's my score this week? What are the areas I want to improve upon? Who are the people I need to call in order to get some support? Look at your life through the lens of how can I be the best me to show up to be the ally in this work? And so once you do that reflection, I'm behind in my pages. Tina, as an equity champion and an equity coach, how have you been challenged in your work to grow racial equity in your teaching?
So one of the biggest challenges for me was actually this very first question, just having this revelation of like, how do I start? Where do I start? And so the very first step and the most challenging one, but the most important, is awareness of self. Like doing that self-work comes before anything else that we have to do. And when I became aware of like who I was, then I could actually bring that process to my students so that they could do that self-awareness work as well. And one of the things that I discovered in doing equity work is that I was not putting equity in moments of listening. I was like so proud of myself. Okay, I got this. But it wasn't in the moments of listening to my students. And so in this journey of that self-awareness, what I heard my students say to me was, Dr. Curry, I am not going to give you permission to be my teacher until you teach me in the context of my life. Wow. And it sounded so loud and I received it. And so it's that self-awareness work, and you'll have your own discovery. So teachers, I really want to challenge you to do the self-awareness work. It's a very powerful ally.
And when we look at bringing this into our teaching, I want to share with you a strategy that actually is integrated into a couple of lessons that we have for free for teachers on the citizenu.org website. That's citizen-u.org. And it's to have those courageous conversations. And it's actually a strategy that you can implement in your classes. And those of you who've had courageous conversation training know the importance of using I statements, of experiencing the discomfort, of staying engaged, and knowing the difference between your intent versus impact around your language. When we have courageous conversations, we're agreeing to be an ally. We're agreeing to say, I'm going to show up. I'm going to speak the truth from what I know, and I'm going to be willing to listen. But it's a first step that we can do.
Donna, what's a practical tool we can give to teachers to begin?
Okay, so that was all the buildup for these tools. So we wanted context and depth to what's happening. But what we know for sure is that the Library of Congress has a vast array of resources for us to use as teachers that spark the courageous conversations we need to have. And there's a tool in the Library of Congress, if you're not familiar with it, called the Primary Source Analysis Tool. And Brennan is putting in the chat the URL that will link you to the interactive form of the Primary Source Analysis Tool, which is extraordinarily powerful. If you look at the tool that's on your screen, which is just a screenshot of what's on the URL, you'll see there's a drop down that allows you to select any format of primary source that's listed in the library. And then what the library within the Teaching with Primary Sources program has done is created inquiry prompts that guide students to a deeper insight to what is going on and how to take the context of that primary source and integrate it to new learning and what we would say is transformational learning around equity. So you can intentionally use that historical context. And as we go through the webinars, we're going to talk about taking that historical context and moving it to a current day context and using the framework of inquiry that the library has so well established for us and carrying it through our other work. And Susie, can you kind of guide us through what it might look like to use the PSA tool with our students?
I sure can, Donna. In fact, we've been sharing out. Now you're going to get a chance to share back with each other. What we know is that images such as these primary sources will elicit very, very different feelings and responses from our students. Remember, this is not easy work, but it's really necessary. When we use the questions in the PSA tool, we can help our students to have that safe place Donna talked about, to look at pictures like this and answer deliberately. First, what they see. Okay, what do you see? Just the observations, nothing else that you're putting into it. Then you can go deeper and say, secondly, what do I think? What do I think? And then third, what do I wonder about? So there's an order to it. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is look at the picture up there. And we're going to cheat a little bit in the interest of time, but I want to give us all a chance to give some feedback. So if your first name starts with initial A through G, I'm going to ask you to throw an observation in. Okay, just what you see. And if you can start it with I see, and then throw something in the chat. The next group at the same time, right behind that, H through P, if your name starts with H through P, what do you think? So I think, and if you can say something about that picture, not just an observation, you get to put a little thought into that now. And then Q through Z, I'm hoping we have some. If not, anyone else can join in. That's part of our team, that's fine. What do you wonder about? So you would start out, I wonder. So let's start populating that and take a look at the chat. Take a minute to do it. We, of course, this would be a much longer activity with the students, but let's give this a shot.
One thing I think was really interesting as Susie and Felicia and Tina were preparing for this, and we used this primary source, which is a rally at the state capitol in 1959 with the Little Rock Nine event. What was striking to me, and I'm a former history teacher, was the deep emotion Tina and Felicia experienced in looking at this photo, which was different than what Susie and I. It shouldn't have been shocking to me, but I wanted to kind of follow the ritual of let's look at I see, I think, I wonder. And the reality is our colleagues, our African-American colleagues, were stuck in the emotion. And so Tina said it so well, but what she had said is, I can't do this right now. I want to do it for you, but I can't. You know, and she very much is an immensely intelligent woman, a scholar, and said, I'm having a hard time thinking. So it's interesting to me, and something that I think as teachers we sometimes plow ahead, but it's a great opportunity for us as we look at the differences in the chat of what's there about what you might just see, what you observe. We see the differences of our own perspectives and our own culture, and it lends itself for us to have a deeper conversation about racial equity and to really unpack what that means. Tina, is there anything you wanted to add?
Just to consider how the primary sources, which are a great way to have these courageous conversations, but how something like this may land on students very differently, and giving them the moments in time to process the emotions so they can do the cognitive work you're asking them to do.
Absolutely. The comments in the chat were phenomenal. We capture those, so I can't wait to look through all of them. I hope you've had a chance. If you're wondering what this is, because there was a lot of wondering, this is the state capitol in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1959.
Great.
Okay. I'm going to give you a second to unpack this. We're not going to go through the same chat responses again. I want you to take a look at this. What do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder about? And just pause. It's a lot to take in. I find this very emotional myself. I'm going to give you a second to unpack it. And let's think about something after we look at this very emotional slide here. It allows us to have that safe space to ask those questions about racism so that we can start with that healing, okay? If you look, there are two questions that are coming there. They're from the Racial Healing Handbook. What did you learn in your family about the history of racism? What did you learn in school about racism? Tina and Felicia, I'm going to ask you to speak to that as we're looking at this slide.
Tina, do you want to start?
You can start, Felicia.
About racism, when I first saw the slide, you know, and as you read the captions, it's like, even with the oppression of his master, this slave is still willing to risk his life to save his life, you know. And I think my thoughts are that, you know, the man that's in the water, it's like he's just been taught what racism is, you know, and it's like this was a lot. I think because when I looked at this slide again and again, there's so much more that I see in it, but I think about racism. I think about people who have issues against another group of individuals, and they really don't even understand why. All they know is it's something that's been passed down from generation to generation. Tina?
Susie, when you asked that question that made it more personal and immediate for me, it felt like a lot of weight and gravity wearing me down, because if you just look at just the images without even looking at the words, because pictures carry so much meaning, and I tried to make it personal to my own life. So I serve as an equity coach, and you can see I'm a Black woman. So as a Black woman leading equity work, that's me reaching my hand out to my white colleagues to say, let me help you to do this work of being an effective teacher for young people of color. And them refusing, and then in the background, those are some of my colleagues who support me on the sidelines. And it was just really, really painful, but like I experienced this form of like oppression and racism, but just in a very different way, but just as painful.
Tina and Felicia, thank you so much for sharing. When we were working together, that was just an amazing discussion. And you know, we have to have those courageous conversations in and out of the classroom. Okay, so Donna, I'm going to throw this one at you, being a former principal. What guidance would you give teachers?
You know, one of the things that we need to, as especially those of us who are white educators, we need to look at the language and the words that we choose. When I was principal, we often said that's the sentence that's right on your screen. Our school is becoming more diverse each year. We would laud our diversity. We are a diverse school. The reality of the school where I was principal, which was definitely one of the most incredible experiences of my life, is that we were 90% African-American students. But we would often say we're a richly diverse population because it sounded nice. Courageously, what I should have said is that each year, the number of Black students is increasing. The number of white students is decreasing. That was the truth. But that felt, at that time in my academic life, very risky to say. That shouldn't be a risk. That should be a source of truth that says, if we have 90% Black students, how do we serve them with equity? It's just like, if you look at traditional conversation, we try to soften everything. It's not their culture to disagree with the teacher, but really brown families more than Black and white families are likely to view the teacher as now the knowledgeable authority figure. That's the truth. We all know that as educators. If you've had Black and brown students, you know there's a difference in the way that you're viewed as an educator. What's important to us in order to advance equity in our classroom, and using primary sources gives us a tool to do this first academically, is to have a way to practice using explicit language that will call us to a higher level of equity, that we could then stop the unconscious bias, the implicit bias, and raise our awareness to a truth that would exist so that we can change that truth. So it's only through those courageous conversations. It's being very intentional, and using the Library of Congress resources and the primary source analysis tool gives us a way to do that, to practice it. And we're not going to be perfect. Certainly we're not, but we can try it. And so, Tina, in addition to the way the Library of Congress presents us with historic evidence, what are other ways that we can integrate equity into our work? You're a phenomenal teacher and equity coach, and I know you do lots of different things, both in CPS and for us at DePaul and at National Louis. But what are some of the things that maybe teachers can consider?
So I just want to speak for experience, if you would bear with me for a moment. So I was that teacher leader who was just blaming everyone else. Like, why are they teaching in the school if they don't know how to teach Black kids? And then I realized, like, I became like the person who doesn't vote, but then complains about who's in office. And I didn't want to do that because blame language wasn't getting me anywhere. And then I had to realize, and like, well, you will have to do too, for those of you who are listening to us, is that you're going to have to come to, like, what is going to be your role in this critical moment. And for me, I wanted to advance equity and I wasn't getting it done by complaining. So I decided to start an equity book club, and I started 3 years ago. And I've had peers who have been consistent parts of the book club. I started forming racial affinity groups to hold space for us to just talk about our shared narratives. And so those are some of the ways that I have shown up for my peers and my students to integrate equity. So it's just about deciding what you're going to do. Like, you have to take some type of action, even if it's messy, if it's scary. We have to start somewhere, because our young people don't have time for us to sit around and try to get comfortable with the work, because it'll never be.
Thanks so much, Tina. And actually, your equity book club inspired me. We started an equity book club with some colleagues at DePaul. And what we found after we finished a book, which we read, How to Be an Anti-Racist, then we realized that we had some other ways that we could have dialogue. And what we were doing is using Library of Congress resources of heroes that we may have had to spark conversations between us. So whether we're looking at, Martin Luther King or at John Lewis, it was that each one of us each week would pick a hero and a legend who inspired us, and then we'd start a discussion around that so that we could keep equity at the forefront. But Tina, as you think about those legends, how do you recommend that we do what John Lewis calls us to do, to start that necessary trouble? And we know that, and I know you know this, in school systems, there's a hierarchy and there's a risk to starting trouble. And we're in a whole bunch of heap of trouble right now in our school system. But how do we how do we do this work and do that necessary trouble and keep our jobs?
Yeah, and keep our jobs. So this was the first time I've ever just really delved into primary sources the way I did in preparation for our time together this afternoon. And I do think that the primary sources can be used as a great way to just teach your students how to read the world, teach them how to navigate racism, use the primary sources to teach your students how to question, how to discern truth from falsehood. And one of the things that a friend of mine said, he said, I am not trying to teach a nation of well-behaved students. I want students to act on their greatness. And John Lewis would agree with him. I heard him say one time that when you get to the heart of things when you disrupt. And so we can use those primary sources to teach our young people to be disruptors. And this is the time to do it. So many young people are exploring activism. Like, teach them how to like show up and how to improve their own lives. I think that's the lesson that John Lewis was trying to teach us.
Oh, it's so beautiful. And I know, Felicia, you work with some middle school girls, and I'm always just in awe of the way that you help them to navigate the world. What do you think? How can primary sources open their hearts? And maybe you can share with us a story about working with those young women.
Wow. I have to start off by saying, first and foremost, I've learned so much, so much. And I'm the grown-up, right? From these young ladies. But more recently, there was a question that I posted to the group, and the question was, what makes you unique? Well, I didn't know that they had intentions on answering the question, but I went and I checked, and I saw that one of the young ladies responded to it. And I don't know if we could just take a minute and let them read that, or as you guys are reading it. It was mind-blowing. It really was. And she even states in that, it was mind-blowing to me. She's maybe 12 years old. Yeah. She's going into the 8th grade, and she is truly a game changer, this young lady. I mean, they all are. But when it comes to like their self-awareness, and like you said, Tina, about activism, they are so ready to get out there and to change the world. But when I think about like historical legends and people that came into their own self-awareness, one that for me was really enlightening was when I reflect back on Malcolm X. And when I think about Malcolm X and how there was this, and when we talk about racism and we talk about all the hatred that was instilled in a person, right? It was only after he returned from his trip to Mecca, when he came back and he saw that this was such an untruth, because he was sitting next to individuals with blue eyes, green eyes, and they had skin that was pale. And when he had that self-awareness, like these young ladies are coming into their own self-awareness with different questions that I asked them, it is something that I think is so important for educators to be willing to do as well. You can learn so much from them. Mm-hmm.
So Tina, and I love it, and what you need to know about that little story that Felicia said is that the girls prior to Felicia working her magic, and we used some primary sources actually with them early on to open up their hearts, they would come to these sessions and just say nothing. So they weren't at that place. It took the questioning and inquiry and being present with them and holding space to get the depth of that response that you saw from that young woman. But Tina, so as classroom teachers, we want these RISE webinars to be practical. What do you think a teacher can do right now? What's the thing that they can either use from the Library of Congress, or what can they do today?
So first we have to just come to the realization that although COVID-19 is a shared enemy, it is not the great equalizer. It impacts us in very different ways. And so just acknowledging that, and then just taking the time to heal. This is a time for us as classroom teachers to pause, go inward, process what has happened to us, and then see ourselves as healers. We have to heal. And then it's going to be so important when our young people return to us that we do not allow ourselves to get hooked on just a single story, just this one thing about them. There is so much more to our students that meets the eye. And then use the Library of Congress resources to like delve into inquiry, to like stir up these really great conversations with your students. And again, tap into that activism. I think that's how you're going to get them to get up and log on and spend time with you every day as well.
Thanks so much, Tina. And so I want to, as we get ready to close today, I want to share with you again those 3 things that we really hope for you and our hope moving forward. We want to make sure that in these 3 webinars, we create a shared language for talking about racism and intentionally being equity driven in all that we do. And all of the instruction and the awareness that we bring to our students. We want to help you to engage in reflection and inquiry and self-awareness and empathy. We want to give you time to heal. You have such an arduous path ahead of you, those of you who are classroom teachers and those of you who are educators in any context. We're going through levels of uncertainty that no one has gone through before, and so there's no rule book for this. So we want to give you that time to heal and to have the tools that you need to continue this important work. And we want to help you with real concrete next steps that you can use. The primary sources, you can use the programs at DePaul and through the Bear Education Foundation so that we can really together create a world that is civically minded, that really wants to do what that young woman in the little quote, I can't say her name because we don't have her permission, but we have her permission to share the quote, what she says she's ready to do, become those agents of change. And so as we end today, I am going to do this as Felicia. Could you share like 30 seconds of Genius Hour, what you did with your students while I get the right movie up?
Felicia, she meant to say Tina.
Tina, sorry. Yes.
Right. So Genius Hour is, I would almost call it like a movement, but it's a structure where you literally just do that. You allow students to realize the genius that's inside of them, where students do a project where they follow their own passion. That was quick, Donna.
That was perfect, because that too is a way for you to use the Library of Congress. So we wanted to end with this. We want to thank you all for coming, but we want you to all sit, take a really deep breath, let your shoulders fall down, and listen to the words of a prophet and a legacy, and be inspired and take up this call.
While my time here has now come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story, when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people motivated simply by human compassion laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. That is why I had to visit Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, though I was admitted to the hospital the following day. I just had to see and feel it for myself, that after many years of silent witness, the truth is still marching on. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at the time. I will never ever forget the moment when it became so clear that he could easily have been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Though I was surrounded by 2 loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best. shoot unwitting concert goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide.
So we are ordinary people with extraordinary vision, and we thank you for the time with us today, and we do hope that all of you will go out and make that necessary trouble. And join us next Tuesday at 3:30 for our next webinar.